I was going to use the clicker, but I don't think I will. So I'm going to give you an overview of some work that I've done years ago, but this project's kind of interesting because it's progressed over the years. I've done this a little bit more, right? And I started out one way, and I'm going to end a very different way. Do you want lights down? Because you won't be able to see the image, I don't think. There you go. So this is a historic photograph that is of Chinese workers on the railroad. You're going to see a few of them. But there, and I'm going to take you through some websites too to kind of show some of their history. But maybe I'm not progressing at all. There we go. I wanted to put up, I stole it from your website, by the way. Jenny, thanks. I wanted to put up Joan Crawford too because, again, this series is in her honor. So wanted to just kind of highlight some of the history of her at Garrett College and some of this work she did after Garrett College. So she's done a lot. When I came and I interviewed, I love giving public lectures. I love going to public lectures. And I was like, we should do one. And somebody's like, well, there was one. And I'm like, well, why don't we do this again then? And so we started it back up. And Jenny's been the brains behind the operation. I'm just trying to solicit people. A little bit about myself. This is me teaching in Alaska. You can kind of see the map back there. If you don't know what that map is, that's Alaska Native languages. So it's pretty multicultural in a lot of ways, but that's just a big difference. And within each one of those colors, there's a lot more variation. But I'm teaching a class of students right now, basically what I'm talking about today, bioarchaeology. All the skulls that you see in that picture are fake, so they're all plastic. We talk a lot about ethics before they handle real human remains, but in my class they do handle real human remains to see the variation and talk about what we can learn about the person, which is what I'm going to tell you today. So the students are looking at some stuff. If you don't know what bioarchaeology is, it's a specialization within biological anthropology. It's essentially when Indiana Jones goes out and does his stuff, and they find bodies, somebody has to analyze those bodies. And so that's where I come in. Some of my colleagues work on mummies, Egypt, Peru. I've seen a mummy. There's actually a mummy at Carlin. I'll explain that in a little bit. But we look at the body to see what we can tell. My professor's professor used to call it reading the bones. So we read the bones and try to understand who they were. I work primarily with ancient and historic remains. I've done forensic stuff, which is like legal cases, like homicides, all kinds of stuff. I prefer thinking about people that lived 1,000 years ago and what they were doing. I just recently flew to Alaska last weekend to study a site where there was 1,000-year-old human remains from Alaska, and I worked with the tribe to do it, which was kind of fun and interesting. But I'm interested in questions of identity, health and disease, conflict and violence, social inequality, ethics, and repatriation, which is an archaeological word for meaning giving back the bodies and reburying them, right? We used to keep them for a long time. Now we give them back. So a little bit about me. This is a site that's 20,000 years old or so, but you can see the burials. This is what the burials, artists reconstructed, but this is what they actually look like. I'm showing you just artist pictures because you're not seeing the real human remains, but they're young. One's a little older than the other. They're kids. They're highly adorned with all kinds of stuff. They have lots of objects with them. Anytime we have a society that we consider small scale and they have lots of objects with them, we start asking questions about why. Why do these people have so much stuff? What does it mean? And there's lots of interpretation of these sites. This is, again, reconstructing with the clothes on. We don't know if how they were buried. They could have had clothes on. They might not have. It's 20,000 years ago. There's nothing left, right? The only thing left are bones, some wood, beads, all kinds of other things. But they are unique. So bioarchaeology is just the study of humans in this context. And what we really want to know is the context. A long time ago in my field, they used to just bring us boxes of bones. Hey, tell me about this box of bones. I'm like, well, they're bones. What do you want to know, right? Male, female, 30 years old, okay. But with this context, I can tell you a whole lot more, right? I can tell you maybe what they're eating. I can tell you what kind of objects they had, potentially all kinds of things. So context is important. So I put that up there just so you think about that, because with the Chinese group, we're going to talk a lot about context. This is a diagram my professor made and I made, and I think I published it at one point. It's out there somewhere. But the reason it's up here is just to show you that all the things that we do. So archaeology is a big part of it. I mean, it's in the name, right? So I go out to sites. I've excavated sites. I've dug holes for a living. My mom always said, go to school or you'll dig ditches. And I was like, I went to school and I dig ditches, probably for less money, but I still dig ditches. Anyway, so I look at site construction, site location, material culture, all the things that you might think of when you think of archaeology. But I also am a biological anthropologist, so I'm trained in anatomy and physiology. I study osteology primarily, so bone biology, but I study paleopathology, which means diseases in the past. You can see things like cancer on the bones, tuberculosis on the bones, brucellosis, syphilis. In fact, when I have the syphilis skull out, I always tell the students, like, hey, practice safe sex, right? Syphilis is bad. Evolutionary theories in there when we talk about changing of cultures and stuff. Cultural anthropology, ethnography is ethnohistory, is talking about beliefs and behaviors. Obviously, if I'm working 1,000 years ago, I might not be able to talk to those people, but I can talk to descendants of those people that can tell me oral traditions about what they used to do, right? What the grandparents told them, that their grandparents told them, so on and so forth. With the Chinese, this is going to be important because they didn't have written records. Even though they could write, none of that's preserved. We have very few written documents, so it's a real problem. There's a hole, and history needs written documents, right? So we have to go through and talk to the descendants of the Chinese, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then forensic science really studies what happens to the body after death, which is important because I'm going to talk about some trauma that happened. So taphonomy is just what happens once you bury a body, the way that it decomposes, how fast it decomposes. There's a place over in Tennessee at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. It's called the Body Farm. It's kind of a creepy name, but people donate their bodies to science and things happen to them. They've done like wood chippers. They've done all kinds of things because they want to understand what happens to the body after death. I've been there. It's an interesting place. I didn't go out to the farm because they were training at the time, but I've seen some of the bodies. There's negative representations of human skeletal remains, but I'm going to hopefully tell you the good things, what we can learn from them, right? But they're used for poison, pirates, you name it, right? We have all kinds of things bones. Halloween props. I started my own kind of body farm. I used to bury black bears because they're kind of similar to humans, and brown bears, whatever bears I could get, really. But I had a whole bunch of them, and my students would dig them up. But one time I buried a Halloween prop just for fun. And they got to dig that one up. But they still had to map it in place. It was a Halloween prop, but they still had to do it. Each bone tells a story. Every bone. I worked on a project that is from a site called in the UAE, or United Arab Emirates. It's called Tel Brak. It's about several thousand years old. We looked at just the patella, so just the kneecap. We looked at 486, I believe. That's a lot of kneecaps. But we studied them to understand things like rotational injuries. Anybody ever hurt their knee in here? Had any kind of knee issues or surgery, right? We can see that on the bone. That's going to show up, even if you have it fixed. So we were looking at those kind of things. One of the conclusions we came to is this is a fishing culture. We looked at isotopes from the bones, other things, diet reconstructions from some of the stuff they had there. And we were thinking maybe they were throwing nets. And that's why we saw so many rotational injuries. And there's some modern day data to support that. People that throw nets all the time tend to have rotational injuries of the knee. But every bone can tell you something. Some are more useful than others. The pelvis for biological sex, because women have babies. That's a good one. The head. But the focus of this presentation is on Chinese laborers that helped build the railroad all the way up to Promontory Point in Utah. I grew up in Utah. It's a pretty neat little place. You don't hear a lot about Chinese. I'm just going to tell you that now, but it's changing. This is a real photograph of a Chinese worker. He's got tea. He's carrying tea. It's an old photo, but this is kind of quintessential. You see it show up on a lot. If you look at some of these books, you'll probably find a picture. This one's probably in there somewhere. But blasting through canyon walls with dynamite, right? I mean, this is some dangerous stuff. And the Chinese were sometimes sent into those to do that dangerous stuff, but we'll talk about why. Can bioarchaeology contribute to our understanding of the Chinese diaspora or the Chinese migration to the US? It's actually all over. Chinese end up in Hawaii, they end up in Australia, they end up in South America. They're moving all over the place. When China has this, there's a war happening, there's a few other things happening. People start to migrate out to look for work and send money back. And one of the places they end up is in the US, right? So there's a huge China diaspora. How can the bones reveal experience of the Chinese who lived in this place called Carlin, Nevada, which is on the map right here, still there, still a city, small city, between Reno and Utah along the railroad. It was actually a terminus site where the railroad would stop and turn the train around and then send it out again. I am not the first person to look at these bones, just to clarify. So these bones were dug up in 97. In fact, there's an archaeology article about the bones when they were dug up, and they're like, and Ryan Harrod excavated the bodies in 1997. I was like, I was in middle school. Like, there's no way that I did that. Right? And I got called the archaeologist. I'm like, I'm really sorry. I don't know how they got that. Anyway, I've analyzed them, but I did not excavate them. There's a famous anthropologist named Doug Owsley. He works at the Smithsonian. He did Jamestown, so here, local stuff, kind of local, right? He looked at the bodies there. He's done a few other famous cases. But he looked at them a long time ago and did basic biological profiles. Su Feng Chang is a Chinese historian. She looked at the stuff that they found, working with somebody else, a bunch of other colleagues. They basically started to put them back in the cultural context. She did this amazing thing where she went and got them death records for Nevada and looked to see who died at the time. The coroner's writing down deaths. And then she tried to match them to the bodies, which actually one of them I think is right. I mean, there are multiple right, but I mean one that we're going to talk about. Ryan Schmidt was a grad student in my school before me, several years. He did some biological distance stuff, and he looked at some lethal violence. In fact, I told him I was giving this talk, and he sent me a slide, so I threw it in there. This guy did some stuff a long time ago, looking at markers of inequality. I was really interested in the inequality stuff. I worked with another grad student who we worked several times together. We looked at it in a larger picture, so we took Carlin as one place and then looked at Chinese that were in other locations. Not a lot of burials have been analyzed, and I'll talk about why. And then we did re-injury and social violence, put that in another book, and then the last one was kind of fun. I worked with a zooarchaeologist, or somebody that studies animal bones. I worked with an ethnobotanist, so they study plant remains. And then I worked with a historic archaeologist that studies medicinal bottles. And all of us together, along with Crandall, we all looked at Chinese health and well-being from all those different directions. And we wrote this chapter in this book right here, which is a large book, but it's it's interesting. Lots of different chapters about health and well-being, and talked about what we found at all these different sites with Chinese health. Fascinating thing about that is that they are doing all kinds of neat things, like lots of traditional food is being eaten. They're doing traditional medicine along the railroad. So they're keeping their culture with them. And in fact, the railroad's going to support it because they're such good workers. They're like, yeah, here's some traditional food. So this is Ryan Schmidt's work. This is kind of complicated looking graph. Well, all this is when you take a bunch of skulls and you look at kind of the size and shape of them, you can plot out some mathematical formulas, right? So Jeff's back there. He could help explain it for us. But they basically did distance analysis for the Chinese. And this got moved, I think. But Guizhou province is what we're looking at. This is where most of the Chinese go back to. It's not shocking. I mean, it is interesting, but that's what the ethno-historic records said, so that we know that that's where they're from. There's records. And in fact, my colleagues that I worked with, some of the historians, they flew back and actually did work here, looking at Chinese building railroads in China, right? Some of them went back. And so they worked in Guizhou province as well as what we're talking about in the US. So some interesting stuff has been done. This project is by far the most interesting that I was ever able to be involved in. It's out of Stanford. It's the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project. It's now over. I went there three times. Anyway, and we basically collaborated in a large interdisciplinary way. And I'm just going to show you if it works. PowerPoint's like, no. It might not work. We'll see. But I'll talk while it pulls up. The website, because they have some interesting. Oh, here we go. So the book is obviously a product of that. That's why that's up there. But this is, let's go home. We don't want key questions. The website, they have videos on here of some of the stuff they've done, the publications that came out of it. But I can always send you a link. We're going to talk about this book in just a second. This book is up there as well. This is an interesting book because it's stories from the descendants. So people still live in the U.S. that their great-great-grandparents were railroad workers, right? And they can talk about the stories. So that's an amazing book. You can look at it after if you want. This is the one where they went back to China, and they were working. This got published in, I think, Taiwan. So actually working with some of this. So they published in Chinese as well, which is kind of cool. And then there's an article that we're in and other things. But the project was interesting because it changed my research. And the reason it changed my research is because I had all these other people asking me questions about why I was asking these questions. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I'm asking questions about violence because I'm interested in violence. They're like, but what about questions descendants are interested in? I'm like, that's a valid point. Maybe I should ask some other questions, right? So I did. I put this up here because Gordon Chang is an author of that book. He is a descendant from a Chinese railroad worker, historian at Stanford. But he wrote a quote to me. He said, "Thank you for introducing me to the dark side." The first time I showed up and started talking about human remains, I was seen as kind of like the creepy guy, right? Like I'm talking about their ancestors, some of these people's ancestors, and like, why are you doing that? But in the end, it actually became a great collaboration, right? I could show them the value of looking at the human remains in an ethical way, right? And so this is a great book too, if you're interested in reading it. This is single-authored book that he writes, just the history of the Chinese diaspora. It's a really good book. It just came out as well. But just to give you a quick story, he talks about Hun Kin recalled that when he was young, he heard other, certainly more encouraging stories about the outside world from his young relative who had ventured overseas and returned to the village. He told of strange cities of people with red hair and blue eyes, solid gold nuggets in the mountain. The cousin came back from California and spoke about the riches of Gold Mountain, or Jingshan. Gold Mountain is a thing. It's a place that's in China, so people talk about Gold Mountain. So named because the gold rush in 1849, and so the Australia gold rush, and then the Nevada Comstock lode, the California gold rush. All these things are going to draw people. The tales bewitched the young Hu King. He recalled that his mother told him that once when he was in a feverish delirium, he babbled incessantly about nothing else but wanting to go to Gold Mountain. He contracted gold fever, and he goes over to the U.S. That's something to keep in mind. A lot of these people weren't coming for the railroad at first. They were coming for the gold, right? They were coming for every reason that you can think of, all the colonial counters, opportunities, right? So people were getting on the boats and coming. There were gold miners. There were loggers. They logged a lot. Su Feng Chung, actually it's this one. This book talks about some of the logging adventures that they did. She wrote a whole nother book about it. But they were here to do lots of things. Eventually, though, they're going to be contracted for the railroad because there's a lot of money in the railroad. I threw up the C&O Railroad just to, a little homage to this area. But the Transcontinental Railroad we're talking about is over here. And we're basically talking about the Chinese taken from here over to here, right? And there's bridges they built that are still standing today. Amazing amount of labor goes into this. Leland Stanford, founder of Stanford, right, is trying to build this. It's expensive. Somebody suggests to him, hey, why don't you use Chinese labor? And at first he's like, But then they do it, and it changes. I mean, he would have never finished that railroad had it not happened that way. And this is being recorded. Never mind, I won't say that. I was going to tell a story, but I'll tell it afterwards. Anyway, a little perspective on this is the elevation. So here we are, right? We have some mountains. I love them, by the way. That's one of the reasons I moved here. But this is the mountain range that they're going through as they're building this railroad, right? So it's a huge elevation change. I mean, they're going from San Francisco up and over the Sierra Nevadas or through the Sierra Nevadas, right? And it's risky. So this photo is a historic photo, again, of some of the people coming across. But this is the summit of the Sierra, about 8,000 to 10,000 feet, right? So that's where they're at. That's the railroad going over. Historic photograph of Chinese laborers along the Sierra Nevadas. So this is the crew preparing to excavate snow-covered portion. I was going to put in a quote. There's newspaper quotes that are in some of these, I think in this book, where we talk about there was avalanches, and it would be like unnamed Chinese people killed, right? And they'd use other terms, but killed by avalanche, right? Not like so-and-so died. It was just several, because it was dangerous, right? Clear these roads. But this is lots of labor, lots of risk. But they also had a lot of agency. That's one thing I didn't put in my very first article is I didn't really highlight the agency as much as I should have. I mean, they were fighting legislation to get rights. They were filing court documents. And they had the first major labor strike in the U.S. They basically said, we're not going to work unless you pay us better, right? And so they did. So this is Chinese railroad workers basically protesting. And this is a funeral procession. But you go to this site I linked at the bottom, and you can see some of the labor strike events. All right, so now I'm going to show you about human remains, but I will say there are some real bones in here, but I took out all the Chinese remains. In the old days, I mean, they're published in some of these books, but again, I don't show it as much because field has changed, right? I mean, you don't need to see the remains for me to talk about the remains. And nobody asked them or their descendants if we should show those remains. There was a big project that just happened. It's called the MOVE project, but there was recently somebody showing remains on a class, right, on recorded class that got out, and those remains were from kids that were killed that happened to be African-American kids that were being used in the classroom and caused a lot of problems. And there's a good reason. And we often use bones without thinking about the fact that they're people. So I'm going to show you bones, but only to show you things on how we understand things. I use what we call a biocultural model. You don't have to know what that means necessarily, but it basically, we put the biology back into the culture, right? We can't understand. Humans are unique from every other animal because so much of our biology is like affected by our culture, right? Whether it's air conditioning and heating, clothing. I mean, this is kind of probably going to sound gross, but you can track the evolution or the change of lice, right? When did lice evolve? You can see head lice versus pubic lice versus clothing lice. They're all related, but they change at different times based on when we had clothes, when we lost body hair, and all kinds of stuff. Nothing weird. I always find that fascinating because that's unrelated to humans in some ways, but it's all cultural. We look at individual levels. We look at pathophysiological pathways, genetic factors, individual risk factors, social relationships, living conditions, especially with the Chinese, that's important, right? Neighborhoods and communities, institutions, and social and economic policies, which is going to be huge for this. So to understand these people and their lives, this is again a historic kind of drawing of Chinese laborers, we have to put them back into this whole thing. Know that every part of their life is affected by this more nuanced thing. Have to understand the archaeology. This is the bioarchaeological profile. This is actually the Chinese cemetery. This is Carlin, Nevada. That's how they found the bodies. A farmer found them when they were, not me. Then they called an archaeologist from the Forest Service, and they came out and excavated the bodies. But this is kind of separate a little bit from the Euro-American part of the cemetery, right? So a little separation in where people are buried. So we want to know site context, mortuary context, and demography, which is just who's buried, how old are they, right? That kind of information. Biocultural identity is looking at nutrition, levels of activity, like I talked about that rotational injury of the knee, health, trauma. This is a woman, she's buried in the American Southwest, buried. My professor has worked on her for a long time. I've worked on this one as well. We think that she's potentially a captive. So pre-contact captive individual that was moved. And so one of the things we can look at is demographics at the site, like I mentioned that. There's more women at the site than there should be, and some of them aren't treated well. So she has a head trauma that was healed on her head. She also has some hip issues. Compare her to another woman at the site who's buried with artifacts and grave goods in a formal way. It's like, well, what's going on, right? So some of my colleagues do this in South America, and they can study isotopes and see where people are moving from, and you can see that they're being moved in or taken in from a long ways away. This makes me sad because my knees get worse and worse as I get older. But they pop, but not loud enough, I'm sure. I have pretty bad knees from archaeology, but you can think about all the things that happen as we read the bones. We can look at those, right? Degenerative knees. If you got gout or bunions, right? Wearing high heels, for example, there's all kinds of interesting things that change with that. We can look at fractures of the hand that are related to violence or manual labor, all kinds of other things, right? Hip problems, displacement of the hip, arthritis of the hips, right? Spinal degeneration. I have an injury from when I was like 15. I was working at a steel yard, and I tore some muscles in my back lifting heavy steel. And from that injury, by the time I was like 18, I had arthritis in my back, just that one spot, right? So it's got to be worse now. I haven't ever checked. But we can read the bones to understand a little bit about somebody's history. This is where they were housed. This is Carlin, Nevada, was in this lab. This is just it looks like a storage lab, but each one of those kind of closes in and opens up like a museum, like a library. But housed in there are boxes of human remains, lots and lots of them. A lot of them have been removed from this site. There are stuff that are here that are like Southeast Asia. Naya Cave is in there. There's stuff from the UAE. There are donated human remains. There are NAGPRA-related human remains. There's things that have to be repatriated to tribal groups. All kinds of things. So this lab was where they were housed. Before we talk about the bodies, some things to think about Chinese immigrants. When they first were coming over, there was a demand, right? Stanford wanted the Chinese. In fact, there were people that owned shipping companies that were making lots of money shipping Chinese into San Francisco. You can actually track it in the census. It's really cool. Like, if you go to Elko County, Nevada, and you look at the census prior to the Chinese migration, you see like there's no Chinese. And all of a sudden there's a few Chinese, and there's hundreds, and then thousands, right? And where I was at in Idaho County, there's no Chinese there now, but at one point 90% of the county was Chinese, right? There's like a few descendants, there's a Chinese restaurant or something, but like you don't have much, but you can still find the artifacts for it because there are people that were not happy. Eventually you're gonna see some tension. They want people out, they don't want Chinese coming in. They say things like Chinese are taking our jobs, right? The Chinese are coming here, they're gonna do all kinds of bad things. So you have kind of an anti-Chinese sentiment. They're being forced to leave homes at some places. There's anti-Chinese leagues where they go and attack people. I mean, it's pretty bad. And I set that up because I want to talk about the bodies. This is a racial characterization, which is horrible. It's going to be recorded, I guess, huh? Whoops. Maybe edit that one out. But this one, I just want you to think about, this is what's in the like papers, right? This is what's being put out there as propaganda. These poor people don't have jobs because this guy can do that, right? It's not the reality. It's just what's happening is that they're willing to do the jobs that they weren't willing to do, right? And they're coming here to do these things. So more characters of anti-Chinese sentiment, right? Chinese must go. You could see San Francisco in the background. I mean, lots of bad things. There's a play made, Chinese Must Go, right? It's an actual play. And there's Act 1. You can read some of it. I'm not going to read some of it because if you read along, you get like, yikes. It gets pretty bad pretty fast. But they have kind of this sentiment that's dominant in the area. James Blaine, a senator from Maine, we have this day to choose whether our legislation shall be in the interest of the American free labor or the civil labor from China. You cannot work a man who must have beef and bread and would prefer beer alongside a man who can live on rice. It cannot be done, right? It's his argument. Maybe eat rice, I don't know, do the work. But this is the sentiment from some of the politicians. Why I want you to think about this is things are gonna change. Chinese are gonna be affected by these political movements, which is directly related to the boats. So equal rights for all men, but then you have a cartoon of pushing off Chinese, holding down other immigrant groups, right? I mean, lots of people are being discriminated against. This is just part of the politics at the time. Rutherford B. Hayes writes that I am satisfied the present Chinese labor invasion is not any proper sense immigration. Women and children do not come. There's a reason excluded from that. It's pernicious and should be discouraged. Our experience in dealing with the weaker races, names a few of those, is not encouraging. We shall oppress the Chinese, it's not the word they use, at the presence of the hoodlums and vagabonds of their oppressors. So, not good, right? There are people, though, that are fighting for Chinese rights. This is kind of a cartoon showing that, like standing up for labor, that kind of thing. In fact, if you want to, HBO has a series, which is, it's not really like, it's not factual, but it has some factual history in it. But it was written by Bruce Lee a long time ago, which sounds silly. But you remember when Kung Fu, Legend Continues, that kind of stuff came out. Kung Fu was one, but Bruce Lee had this idea about actually having Chinese actors and these talking about Chinese in San Francisco early on. And they were like, nobody's going to watch a show with all Chinese cast. That's not going to happen. Now they've made it, right? Now there's other groups in there too, but they're representing Chinese people. But the show's interesting. It's obviously a drama. There's another one out there. But what they're doing is putting the Chinese back into history, which is kind of cool. I just have this one up here because I like to highlight that Samuel McMullen, a railroad man turned farmer and stockman, was one of the defining characteristics was he was the head of 50 Chinese laborers. That's like his claim to fame. Like he just was in charge of these people, right? Like, what is that? Andrew Canavan was one of the state's most intelligent and progressive and enterprising mining men. Was pivotal in the role of introducing the bill to exclude the Chinese from the state. Right, so Wren in 1904 is talking about critiquing these people. Shortly after it happens, right? The 1904 is the publication date. Late 1800s is the exclusion. But let's go back to the boats. This is a famous photo of Chinese grading a rail bed. The people I work with that are archaeologists and architects and engineers have talked about the story, or the reconstruction suggests that they were the most efficient at this. With shovels, they could grade a bed faster than people could do it than other groups. They were really efficient. So they were out competing all these other groups in the area. And there's tensions because of that, right? But they are really efficient at their job. And this is just showing you one where they're grading that bed. That rail bed still exists. These are real human bones, but when we start to think about all that labor it takes, one of the things I do is I reconstruct what might be activity patterns. This is just an attachment on your humerus, but you can see right here, we all have that attachment, but if you were to look at somebody that manual labor their whole life, that attachment's going to be more rugged. And that's what when you look down here at 3, you can see it. It's a little covered up by my little graphic, but it actually has changed the shape of the bone. That's the muscles pulling on that bone. Right? So bodybuilders get some of these, to give you an idea if you do it habitually your whole life, but also people that do manual labor get these. Right? You can see the difference. So looking at the Chinese immigrants, some of the things we're looking at is these muscle attachments, which were more robust for sure. There's also things like homicide. This is an individual that was 40 or 50 years of age and died. Su Feng Cheng, in her book, reconstructs that she thinks it's a certain individual. His age is slightly off from this, but the problem with skeletal age is that we're limited, right? I can tell you an age range. I can't tell you exact age because you're going to age slightly different than me based on all kinds of things, diet, exercise. But the individual comes out close, and that individual, I think, was hit with a pipe in the head, and it fractured his skull. The skull that I don't have pictured up here, but it's basically what we call a panfacial fracture. It fractured it enough that if you did this today, you'd have to have screws to put everything back together. A gunshot wound does this, severe car trauma, something like that, or being hit with an object, like a bat or a pipe in this case. So burial 10 could be this individual that Su Feng Cheng found records for. There's a few others that we looked at recidivism on, but lots of them had accidental occupational injuries. There was one individual we think is an individual that was crushed by a mining cart. So the ribs are all fractured, chest cavities kind of fractured in different places, but there's a historic document of somebody being crushed by a mining cart and then being buried in Carlin. It's probably that individual. So accidental trauma does happen. You work in blowing up inside tunnels and hanging off the side of cliffs. Things can happen, right? Things to think about too is even though we're looking at Chinese railroad workers, they were brought here for the railroad, some of them, or reassigned to the railroad. But the railroad's a short period of time. They don't just go away. They stay living in these places, in these Chinese towns. Some go back to San Francisco, but others settle in Carlin. So some of these people are shopkeepers, laundry owners, right? They do all kinds of things. Some go into mining still. That's the mining cart guy. Others go into all kinds of things. So they're doing all kinds of things. Some of them are going to do things like cut their hair to look more American, right? That's a big thing. The reason you do that, but you have to keep the queue. The queue is part of your religious ideology. You need it for all kinds of purposes. I'll tell you a story in a second. So that's the queue, right? But if you cut that off, grow your hair out, you look a little more American, then you can fit in, right? You're assimilating a little bit. But they would still keep it because you need that. So we have violence-related trauma, but we also have these extreme muscle markers. So what we could do is look at the bodies and see if it matches what we know is happening, right? So this is San Francisco. You can see violence is happening. Yes, violence is happening. There are some accounts of people being killed along the railroad. So this is just a quote by Felter that in the 1850s, it was likely some of the Chinese immigrants to California had signed misleading contracts and unwillingly locked themselves into form of bondage lasting up to 7 years. Some were kidnapped, some were sold by their clans to brokers, some were desperately poor and sold themselves off in form of indentured servitude. I use the word indentured servitude, and so did he. It's tricky, though, because that's really a European term. So we had a little discussion about terms. He uses it in that one, too. But it might not be the perfect term, but the idea is that not everybody was, there's some exploitation happening, right? You're farming, you're doing this work for them, you're doing labor, but you might not be able to buy out of your contract. And that's going to show up in your body as well. What we look at when we look at those is we look at things that we call structural or cultural violence. I did not make this iceberg model. This has been around a long time. A little slight to economics and historians and journalists and psychologists and geographers and so on. Not really. Some of them do this as well. But one of the things that wasn't traditionally done is people look at violence. And direct violence is like if you see somebody walking down the street get hit in the face by somebody else. You know that's violence, right? You're like, that's violence. That's horrible. If you're walking down the street and you see a homeless person and you don't think anything of it, it's still violence, right? Why does that person not have anything and somebody else has everything? Right? That's where we get into structural violence, and it's bigger than that. Structural violence includes a lot of things, but that underlying iceberg is one of the things they look at. Galtung in 1969 really talked about this. Structural violence turns into direct violence, and the best example is if a husband beats his wife, and that's okay, because society says that's okay, you have a lot of husbands beating their wives, right? That's direct violence. It's all, you can see the direct violence, but it's the cultural violence that says, yeah, no problem, right? Now it's not okay. Some cultures it's still, right, socially acceptable. So we look at this iceberg phenomenon, and with the Chinese, that's what we're interested in. What is happening with some of that? And when you have things like this, you need a Chinese wall to keep them out. That's part of that structural violence, right? You're inciting people to be angry about the Chinese, right? Like, we have these people coming, we have to do something about it. So a couple of things that happen. In 1848, the gold's discovered in California, and Chinese show up. So that's that gold mountain, right? Remember him in a feverish dream talking about gold. He'd heard all this great stuff. He's going to head out a few years after this. Somebody asked me one time, how do the Chinese know what's going on in America? I'm like, because we're there. Like, it's a colonial world, right? People are sailing all over the place. People are telling them about gold. People are migrating. This is like almost the 1900s. 1950, the foreign miners tax mainly targets Chinese and Mexican miners, so other miners aren't there. So there's they're coming to mine, but then there's barriers put up for mining, right? You have about 25,000 Chinese in America by 1852. If you watch one of those dramas that I mentioned that are on HBO, there's one that's called like Wu something, Wu Clan. Anyway, that one might be on Netflix, but they have a great scene I was going to put in here, but I took out. It's a clip, but they're at a restaurant in kind of the middle of Nevada, and the waitress is like, why don't you go back to where you're from? And he's like, my grandparents have been here through like 4 generations, and he gives a real history lesson. Anyway, and then they fight in the thing, not with the waitress, but with other patrons. Anyway, 1848, court rules that Chinese cannot give testimony in court, so you can't fight for your rights if you can't testify about your rights, right? So they're limiting powers. 1862, Chinese Consolidate Benevolent Association formed. This is what you'll see, like if you read old newspapers, you'll hear about Tong Wars. The Tongs are benevolent associations. That's what they're really called. It's essentially like a Lions Club, right, or Elks Club, or anything else where you belong to this group, and they kind of protect each other, and you pay your dues. And then the point of some of these were also to send your body back to China. Everybody wanted to go back to China. These guys did not go back to China, right? They were supposed to. A lot of the bodies did. Some of the bodies are sitting in warehouses, still not reburied. I mean, there's a whole thing about it. But the benevolent societies, that's what they were for, kind of a protection. 1865, Central Pacific Railroad recruits Chinese workers, ultimately employs about 15,000 workers. So they get a whole bunch, right? They bring some new ones in. 1869, the first Transcontinental Railroad is complete. So think about how short a period of time that is. We're talking 4 years, right? So that's we call them the Chinese railroad workers, but that's like a moment in time. It's like an Alaska slope worker. Like, that's not your whole identity, but it's what we're looking at. California passes a law against Chinese importation of Chinese and Japanese women for prostitution. You'll hear a lot about Chinese and Japanese prostitutes. When Su Fang-chung and others have gone back and looked for that, you don't see that as much in the real record, but that's what's portrayed, right? And if you see it, it's exploitation, not so much that people are voluntarily coming for that. Los Angeles had anti-Chinese violence. 18 Chinese people were killed, so on and so forth. Panic of 1863 starts a major economic downturn in the last decade or so, and so you start getting companies losing money. Chino, California has anti-Chinese violence. 1878, the court rules the Chinese ineligible for naturalization of citizenship. So it's a law passed saying you can't be a citizen. Approximately 106,000 Chinese in America. California passes an anti-miscegenation law, so no interracial marriage. So you can't intermarry, you can't bring women over, and you can't be a citizen. What happens eventually? There's no more Chinese, right? That's why we don't have a lot of Chinese now. They're still descendants, though, so obviously not everywhere. I mean, San Francisco is going to have different things happening. Chinese Exclusion Act prohibits Chinese immigration. In 1 year, Chinese immigration drops from 40,000 to 23 people. So we pass a law in 1882 that basically says no more immigration, right? So that is a big deal. The Exclusion Act is a big part of a lot of the stuff they talk about. That's why we lose the Chinese, and it's why they're wiped away from the record, which is how I'm going to finish this. Rock Springs, Wyoming, the anti-Chinese violence is happening. Chinese are moving up. They actually end up in Alaska when I was up there. There's a whole group of Chinese individuals recovered from an island called Kodiak, and they were out doing canning for salmon fisheries, which they were really good at that too. That was like, you can hear the locals talk about it. But when they died, their bodies were given to an anthropologist so that they could be studied. And they're still sitting there, and it's a problem. Eventually, they're going to be repatriated. Luckily, I worked in the village that they were taken from, and I told the villagers, and now they're getting them. Anyway, it's kind of cool. Not me. I mean, I just mentioned it with other people, but they're going to work on it. I hope they get repatriated. So in 1980 or 1892, the Geary Act extends Chinese Exclusion Act. So you have it like it's just reaffirmed. Anyway, so we have immigration stops, right? In my classes, I talk about what other systems of inequality we have. This is just highlighting the migrant Mexican worker program, the guest worker program that was around for a while. There was an anthropologist, though. He went basically undercover, went across to Mexico and illegally came back in. Legally, I guess, because he's a citizen, but illegally. Came back in and wrote about the experience, what it's like not to have health care. What do you do when you're injured? What do you do when when you're hiding and you can't go places because you might get. So just an example of like this kind of stuff still is around a little bit. We have a struggle for recognition of the Chinese people, though. So here we are, Promontory Point, Transcontinental Railroad. They built all of that, right? Mostly them. So that's mostly a Chinese endeavor. There's foremen that are at the head of them, but they're basically Chinese workers that went across the Sierra all the way across, right? So question is, where are they? Before I tell you that, I'll just give you a quick update. This is Carlin, Nevada. This is the city of Carlin. They repatriated those bodies that I've looked at, which is really cool. So they're buried back in the cemetery where they were found. Now, ideally, they would go back to China and be buried in Guangdong province, but the problem is finding people that will bury them, where to bury them. I mean, it should have happened a long time ago. But they have a memorial. They've reburied 13 Chinese individuals. Oh, I forgot to mention the mummy. So Nevada's a desert. High desert up there, but the ground can get really dry, and one of the coffins had so much, it was basically the right conditions that one of the bodies completely mummified. So it has tissue, hair, all kinds of stuff. They were able to do DNA, or they didn't do DNA, but they did analysis. They were able to show that individual had tuberculosis. So some interesting things, and then other things that were interesting. But all of them are reburied now in Carlin. So this is about giving a voice back to the people. This is an archaeologist, Barb Boss. She works in San Francisco and other places, but she looks at all the material culture. She's dug up several major sites. These are people, their ancestors were Chinese railroad workers, and they're giving oral traditions about what's happening. Tracing the migration. It's really hard. Again, there's not writing, so we're looking at artifacts, we're looking at oral traditions, we're looking for things. This is Promontory Point. How many Chinese people do you see in that picture? Yeah, there's no Chinese people. Now watch, this is kind of a cool graphic. This is why it's up here. Those two people that you can see, one squatted down working and the one with right there, those are probably the Chinese workers. So when they did this photo shoot, they basically didn't have the Chinese. They had local people from Utah come in and they took a picture of them at the railroad, but the worker had to go out there and fix something real fast, right? Like, where's the 2,000 or the 15,000 Chinese workers? They're not at Promontory Point. That's going to change though. So they go back, and I was at this in 2019. That was the last time I was at Stanford. We did a celebration, and then it's the 150th anniversary. So at the 150th anniversary, they had Chinese people and descendants there at Promontory Point to tell their story, which is really cool. It's like the first time that you had the Chinese presence. So it was a good project. It turned out pretty good, and it worked out, but it's a long time coming. So when we look at this picture, which is what's in the history books, you see it replicated on every textbook you can find, internet's all over the place. You see the leaders of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroad meet and shake hands in this iconic photograph taken by Andrew Russell on May 10th, 1869, right? Previous scholars and historians believe there were no Chinese workers in this photo, but that's where they identify the two. But then there was no presence of them, so they weren't talked about. I mean, people talked about the marvel of the railroad. How do people get there? Who did it, right? The golden spike, that kind of stuff, but none of the workers. And that project was about trying to change some of that. These are some Chinese laborers. This is a historic photograph of them. So Guangchu, Wang Fok, and Li Shuao were 3 of the 8 Chinese workers who put the last rail in place on a float at the 50th anniversary of the celebration, right? So the Transcontinental Railroad. So they were there. They were there before too. Like they knew, but they weren't in the photo, right? But you could see some of these individuals who were building the America that we have today. The railroad changed a lot. These are individuals from Elko County. These are historic photographs of some people. So you see an individual working in very American-looking clothing, right, along the railroad. People camping, living, shopkeepers. Again, these are some of the people that, this is what they did after. They lived in Carlin. They were residents of Carlin, right? They had exclusion. They had no citizenship rights, but they stayed there and died there. And it's pretty neat that that repatriation happened all those years later, because that was the community that did that. Carlin came together and said, we want to rebury these people that are part of our history. They're part of our community. Not very many Chinese people, right? So they got together and did it anyway, which is awesome. Questions, comments, concerns about that? Yeah.
Well, you talked about the Exclusion Acts.
Yeah.
Various laws.
Yeah.
Were those federal or state?
Yeah, the Exclusion Act's a federal law. It's the first one to ban certain immigration. And later it's, repealed. And citizenship, there's a bunch of court cases that follow up that change some of that. But yeah, that's the first federal law to ban immigration into the U.S.
That's what I thought. The first federal laws that banned groups was the banning Chinese.
Yeah, the Exclusion Act, right. And it's crazy because you had a lot of Chinese. And they're, like they said, they go up to Canada. They're in Canada as well. They go up to Alaska and they're doing all this work, but then it's like a ban, no more immigration, right? Like it's this interesting thought. And it's a short period of time. It only takes a couple of decades for that to happen. Yeah?
Have other studies been done on other ethnic groups, African Americans?
Oh, yeah. Well, Barb Voss, that picture I showed you, I'll just go back so it's kind of a dark side. Her grad student, who's a good friend of mine, works up at Michigan now. She did Mexican workers on the railroad. And she has an interesting finding. They were not even allowed to be seen off the railroad. They had to camp far away so people wouldn't see them when they rode the trains. Like, yikes. But yeah, there's other people looking at that, looking at other groups that are building stuff. Absolutely. So like at the cannery workers in Alaska, when Chinese are banned and they can't have Chinese anymore, they bring Japanese up, and then Japanese can't come, and then it's Filipino after that. So they're constantly looking for labor, right? Industry continues. But yeah, there are lots of groups. This is just focused on the Chinese because these scholars, that's their research, and that was what I was working on, and so it kind of brought this project together. And there's so many of them that aren't even talked about in Nevada or Utah. Other questions?
Oh, that's one. Speaking of desirability of Chinese labor, I read some time ago that before the Chinese came over, they were having a hard time with their laborers, a large percentage of which were Irish. And they found that they, a couple of things, that didn't show up for work all the time because they were drinking. And number 2, they got sick a lot. So the Chinese that came in, even though they felt at first they couldn't do the job because they were too small, blah, 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 but they stayed healthy.
Yeah.
And they figured out because they boiled water for tea.
Yeah, they were super healthy with their diet. That's in this book. That's what we talk about. But they were doing like practicing traditional medicine, which is really cool. The zooarchaeologists found that when they couldn't get like baculum of tiger anymore, so like penis bone, they would go get baculum of like bobcats, and they'd still do their traditional medicine. But they're eating traditional food, so their diet and dentition look great. I mean, they're healthy because you're right. They're eating like traditional tea, drinking traditional tea, eating traditional food. They're a pretty healthy group, and they're laboring and doing well. And so it's not like they were, mistreated in the sense of the structural kind of inequalities. But life was still good. The Chinese people, they survived and thrived and fought for rights and established communities. And they have descendants still here, right? They can talk about them. Yeah.
So that's kind of like, I'll piggyback off of that. 'Cause that's my question is like about repatriation back to
Yeah.
China.
That's probably why they're buried here, yeah.
So some of them, like, even if they don't have families, are buried here, and they're keeping them in America, or
They buried them back, yeah, right back into the Carlin, Nevada site, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. That was the choice. I mean, there's no place to, they can't really connect the families at this point, right? So, and sometimes these people might have been buried in Carlin because they didn't have the benevolent society to send them back. There's all kinds of issues with sending bodies back. But the idea would be buried back in China because it's part of the religion. That's where you need to be. And then you kept your queue because that was part of your getting into heaven as well, right? So even the ones that had Americanized hair, the queue was buried with them. So they were interred with it. Now, the Alaskan ones I mentioned, the woman that dug them up, the foreman's wife, she writes this short letter that's like, I found these bodies to Herlichka, who's a biological anthropologist anyway, sends them off, I'm going to send them to you, but I really like these pigtails, I'm going to keep those. We don't know what happened to them, but they're not with the bodies, so I don't know. Maybe in Kodiak somewhere, maybe? I don't know. I doubt it, but so anyway, yeah, lots of interesting things that happen. Other questions?
Well, you said they ate their traditional food.
Yeah.
So in the late 1800s, was that food imported from China or grown here in the U.S.?
It would be grown here in the U.S., but traditional ways of making it. And they also had traditional wares. So one of the ways we track them, I was trying to go back, when we're looking for Chinese along the railroad, we actually can find Chinese potteries. So they were mass producing stuff, but it would still be Chinese wares, and you can find them. And there's an archaeologist in Montana or he's in Utah now, but he tracks those kind of potteries, and you can trace them back to where, and the railroad companies were supplying the ingredients and the supplies for them to eat traditional diets. So they were
Growing rice can only be done in...
right. So they would buy that and ship it over. Right, you're right.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're mass, remember they're mass importing Chinese too. So the shipping companies can bring all kinds of supplies. Plus San Francisco wants those supplies too. They're using a lot of the traditional stuff. But yeah, so they're bringing it in, and that's where the people that study the plants, that's where they come in. But they're also using local stuff that they can kind of substitute for traditional foods. That's similar kind of ways to do it. That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a plantation in South Carolina.
Uh-huh.
It was primarily farmed by West African slaves.
Yeah.
And they were very good at growing rice. Rice was a major crop.
Right.
I don't know how long that lasted, but it was mid-19th century anyway. And,
Yeah. There's
it was a rice crop in the U.S.
Right. I mean, crops are pretty cool because they can be imported a lot of places. I said crops are pretty cool because you can import them a lot of places if you do it right conditions. Anybody else? Yeah.
So I have a question about the Benevolent Association.
Yeah.
It seems like this would really lend itself to obviously labor study comparisons and immigration studies.
Yeah.
But I think benevolent societies are around really until the Great Depression.
Yeah, they're still right.
But so have there been any comparative studies about that, across?
Yeah, not this whole book, but this book has a whole bunch on benevolent societies. If you're interested, I bought it. I'll just donate it to the library, to Jenny, and she'll put it in the collection. But yeah, it actually has stuff, and I think she might have a little bit of that. But yeah, the benevolent societies are still around. I mean, you can still go to Chinatown and different places like Vancouver, San Francisco, and still see benevolent societies.
I mean, to me, it sounds like what the Eastern Europeans do when they come to the United States.
Oh yeah.
And it's so similar. It seems like you would find lots of cross.
Yeah, and people tend to just cluster when they come anyway because it's safety and and association and language because they're still speaking Chinese, but they're learning American or English. Other questions?
Yeah, well then, that brings up a question.
Yeah.
How long did it take them to assimilate into American culture, that is, learn?
Yeah, some of them probably not that long because Carlin, some of those individuals, they want to be shopkeepers and they want to be they're selling stuff to market, so they're assimilating probably along the railroad. I mean, they're learning English because they have to. The foreman's English, they're learning all kinds of things. So within a few years, most of them are learning how to incorporate into the site. Not all of them do. Some don't. Some go back. Some don't want to be part of. Some keep traditional dress, but a lot of them assimilate because it's easier to be successful when you look like others in the community and speak like others. There's another. I reference popular TV because if you guys are like, I don't want to listen to a talk, you could go watch the popular TV. But there's other things that kind of do that. But that one I think it's called Warrior. That's a series you can watch on HBO that has that. But older one is Deadwood. Anybody watch that show? They kind of talk a little bit about the Chinese experience in there. But Yeah, no, people are assimilating for sure. I mean, some are. These guys are not super assimilated, right? They still have traditional, but you can see that the hair's been cut and some changes. European clothes. When we do the mortuary context, Sufan talks a lot about, but that's one of the things we look at is how much of it is European clothing, how much of it is traditional clothing, like what other items do they have that show assimilation or adaptation, yeah.
One of the things that I have read about is that some of the political arguments that were going on when laws against Chinese were being debated and then passed was that they were, at least supposedly, against the opium dens.
Oh, yeah, opium's a big one. They're using opium, some of them. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's definitely opium around. There's a lot of people who are anti-opium, but the opium is medicinal. That's my colleague, Sarah Hefner, she actually looks at some of that with the medicinal bottles. Now, there's abuse of opium, but a lot of that was directed towards giving it to Euro-Americans, right? Like setting that up. But you can find opium dens and opium pipes and things. Yeah, they're around. Like Idaho. Northern Idaho has opium artifacts all over the place, but it was, again, medicinal. We actually talk about tobacco uses, some medicinal stuff too. So they were using it as medicine, but there's definitely some exploitation. Kind of like today, right? Opioids are medicine, and then take too many of them, and now it's addictive, right? So yes, opium's still part of it. I usually leave out prostitution and opium as discussions because those are the things that people were using to, like, demonize the Chinese, right? Like, all these bad things. But the prostitution was, again, that was probably exploitive like it is today with modern sex trafficking, and then it wasn't quite the same. And again, Su Feng and others have done some work on that, yeah.
But on that subject, I read where groups of prostitutes did follow the construction of the railroad.
Oh, yeah.
And they set up camps.
Same with the mining.
And then, in fact, that's where the term hell on wheels came from.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's also mining camps. When I was up in Alaska, you can go to the mining camps, and I always ask when I go to a mining site, I'm like, so where were the prostitutes? And they're like, oh, they were down in that village, that part of the town, right? Because it's true. I mean, that was a big thing. My colleague is an anthropologist, and she actually studies modern-day prostitutes and looks at past prostitutes and sees some similarities. I mean, there's still active prostitution today, right? Even everywhere. But they're a little discreet for reasons, because it's illegal. It wasn't always illegal.
It was condoned by
Right.
owners.
Oh, yeah. Keep your people, right.
Keep them happy.
Yeah, especially like mining sites where you have like thousands of male workers, and yeah. It's just a thing that existed in the past. Now, the Chinese were not the ones that often were the prostitutes.
Yeah,
This is
that
the
was my
thing.
question.
Yeah.
The ones that came before the Chinese.
It's a lot of European, you're American. So, I mean, it's a lucrative business. That's her whole point, is that there's exploitative prostitution, but then there's voluntary, right? Like people that do it for profit. Anyway, yeah, there's a whole literature on that too. Yeah, any other questions? I just keep putting up pictures here.
Yeah, the picture you just had
Oh,
of
yeah.
the three men. So these are old guys,
Coming back, right?
okay,
Awesome.
for the 50th anniversary of the,
Yep, so you could see them here. But again, if you're interested, you can check out this one. This website's kind of neat. It's linked on here. I can always send it to you. But it goes through the dates, and you can see this changing. But it talks about Sacramento and then where they're at and how they're cutting that, right? Anyway, it's kind of neat. Donner Lake Wagon site, and just shows where the railroad progresses and how the people are doing, and you can kind of follow it along. Like right now, we're right here, but eventually you get all the way to Promontory Point. There's some really neat bridges. Maybe I'll try to show you a bridge. This is Truckee. Camps. They're asking about camps. Maybe I won't show you a bridge. Oh yeah, this is just a zoomed in shot. There's the Golden Spike. Train. There's that famous photo. Anyway. Some of the bridges are still standing. They were really amazingly constructed. So, yeah, this is they're building a lumber. Again, logging was a big part of this. You can't build railroads without railroad ties, so there was a bunch of Chinese logging that, again, wasn't in the history books. That's where some of these books talk about it. Anybody else? Questions? Back to the bioarc part, but like every individual that I've ever looked at tells me something different, and they're all unique, like tall people, short people, right? All kinds of things, trauma. In my classes I used to teach my students, I broke my arm 3 times. I'll just give you a quick story and I'll leave you alone. I broke this arm 3 times. I broke it when I was 5 because I had a dream the night before I could do a backflip. So, and my sister's like 13 years older, and she had a cute friend, and I was like, I'm going to show her my backflip. That did not work out. They were laughing. I was laying on the ground. I was in the hospital. I had like a cast. Anyway, it's bad. So that was 5. At 10, my friend's like, you should ride this Clydesdale. And I'm like, yeah, that's a good idea. So I got on the Clydesdale. It reared up, landed on me, but I was in mud, so I didn't die. But then I sprayed off about a mile away, came back down and got back on the Clydesdale because that was what I did. And then my friend, I'm like, get on with me. This will be safer. Anyway, he kicks the horse in the flanks. It rides off. I hit a telephone pole, break my arm again. Right? So getting to a point here. When I'm 15, I'm wrestling with my friend who weighs about 350 to 400 pounds, 6'6". He dislocates my thumb. I'm like, I'll just relocate it myself. That was a bad idea, right? So I broke it, but then I didn't realize, I knew it, but my mom's like, what happened to your thumb? Like 3 days later, I had to go to the doctor. He broke it again and reset it. So the reason I say that is this is my dominant arm, but it's smaller, and it'll always be smaller. The bones are smaller, watch size is smaller, my muscles are all smaller. Still my strongest arm. This arm is not my dominant, but it's bigger. And there's nothing I can do about it because permanently every marker of that broken bone is there. So when I look at a body, I can see those same things, right? Like if you've ever had a knee replacement, you can see that. I looked at a body at Tennessee where the individual had a hip replacement and both the legs had been amputated, right? And they had dental work, but all those things are permanent, right? Your bones remodel, but you can see them. With these guys, every time they're in a tunnel and there's an explosion and a rock maybe lands on you, you're on the side of a cliff, clearing off areas. I mean, those are all risks that you're potentially going to have an injury that we can look at and identify. And there's violence, which I talked about, but I'm not highlighting. I guess the last thing is there was this debate whether the Chinese actually hung off cliffs in baskets and ropes. They found the basket. So like at an archaeological site, they did, which the Chinese said they did, and so did the historic documents, but there was debates of whether they actually did that. And they would suspend themselves up the side of these things to build these bridges and off the side of imagine, that'd be kind of scary in a basket, but they did it. Anyway, really cool history behind the Chinese workers, and that's what I thought I'd highlight. Any other questions? No, we could go to the library and I could give you books. No, you can look at books.
Thanks, Dr. Harrod. Everyone, let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks.